The rain wasn't just falling. It was shattering against the old farmhouse windows, a million liquid bullets trying to breach the glass. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust, decay, and the faint sweet odor of rotting wood. Elias Thorne sat in his father's worn leather armchair, the only piece of furniture that didn't seem to resent his presence. He was a man carved from weariness, returned to a place he'd spent a lifetime forgetting. The inheritance was a curse, not a blessing. The Thorne family farm? 200 acres of neglected Iowa soil and this crumbling Victorian monstrosity was his. His father, Silas, had died a week ago, found by a mailman 3 days after the fact. The official report said heart failure. Elias, who had spent 40 years learning the specific language of his father's cruelty, suspected it was more likely stubbornness finally crystallized into a fatal condition. He took a long pull from a flask, the whiskey doing little to burn away the chill. The house was a symphony of complaints, the groan of ancient timber, the skittering of some unseen thing in the walls, the relentless drumming of the storm. It was a familiar music, one that had scored his nightmares since childhood. His phone, a sleek and useless slab in this dead zone, had no service. The power had flickered out an hour ago, plunging the house into a gloom fought back, only by the fireplace and a few kerosene lamps. It was in this shifting orange light that he saw it for the first time, a shadow. Not the simple passive kind cast by a lamp and a chair. This one moved with purpose, detaching itself from the deeper darkness of the hallway. It was man-shaped but wrong, too tall. Its limbs too thin, its head a featureless oblong. It slid across the far wall, paused as if regarding him, and then melted into the corner of the room, vanishing into a space that couldn't possibly contain it. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. "Whiskey ghosts," he muttered, forcing a swallow. He was a rational man, an accountant from Des Moines. He dealt in numbers and facts, not in phantoms. But the cold spot that lingered where the shadow had been was a fact his skin couldn't deny. He decided to go to bed, to sleep it off. The master bedroom was his now, a thought that turned his stomach. He avoided looking at the bed where his father had died and instead focused on the simple task of getting undressed. As he hung his shirt on the bedpost, his knuckles brushed against the wallpaper. It was peeling at the seam. Without thinking, he picked at the corner. Beneath the top layer, a garish floral pattern from the 70s was another layer, and beneath that another. It was like archaeology of bad taste. A larger strip came away in his hand, and behind it, nestled in the lathe and plaster, was a small dark cavity. And inside the cavity was a book. It wasn't a diary, not really. It was a ledger, but not for money. The cover was cheap, faux leather, cracked with age. The first page bore his father's tight, angry script. September 12th. Saw the tall man again today, standing in the north field. He was watching the house. Sarah didn't see him. Thank God, she has enough worries. Elias's blood ran cold. The tall man. The name fit the shadow perfectly. He flipped a page. October 3rd, he was in the barn last night. I heard the cows screaming. Found 2 in the morning dead. Not just dead, empty, like something sucked the life right out of them. That had no explanation. Page after page, a chronicle of quiet terror. His father wrote of the shadowy figure, the tall man, with a chilling matter-of-factness. He documented its appearances, its effects, sickened livestock, a pervasive sense of dread, the way the very land seemed to sicken. He wrote of his own research, desperate attempts to understand what was haunting his land. He mentioned a name, scratched out and rewritten, a name from local folklore, the render, a thing that fed on sorrow and fear, that thrived in places of prolonged misery. And then Elias found the entry that stole the air from his lungs. December 10th, it wants more. The animals aren't enough. It feeds on misery. I've been a miserable man, so it's been strong. But my misery is aging, thinning. It needs fresh pain. It whispers to me now. It showed me a sacrifice, a life tied to the land given in sorrow. It showed me Elias, my boy. It wants my boy. The date was 2 weeks before his mother's accident. The car that skidded on black ice, they said. A tragic accident. Elias felt the room tilt. His mother, Sarah, her laughter like sunlight in this dark house. Her life, not taken by chance but given, sacrificed by his father to this render. To save him? To appease it? The logic was twisted. insane. But it echoed with a terrible truth he had always felt in his bones. His father's coldness after her death wasn't just grief. It was guilt. A monstrous, unforgivable guilt. A fresh wave of nausea washed over him, but it was chased by a hot, sharp fury. He threw the ledger across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell open to the last written page. It's not enough. A single sacrifice only sated it for a time. It's hungry again. It's always hungry. It says a thorn must always be here, to feed it, to keep it contained. If I leave, it will follow. It will follow my bloodline. There's no escape, only a delay. Elias stumbled out of the room, down the stairs, and back to the relative safety of his father's chair. The whiskey was gone. The fire was dying. The storm raged on. And now the house felt different. It wasn't just a place of bad memories. It was a prison, a larder, and he was the next meal. He must have dozed off, the exhaustion and shock pulling him under. He was awakened by a sound. Not the rain, not the house settling. A voice. It was a dry, papery rustle, like dead leaves skittering across stone. It came from the hallway just beyond the circle of firelight. "I'm Elias." It knew his name. The sound was not made by a human throat. It was the house itself speaking, the wind given words. He sat frozen, his fingers digging into the cracked arms of the chair. "You came back." The shadow emerged from the hallway again. This time it didn't stay on the wall. It poured into the room, a pillar of absolute blackness that drank the light from the fire. It was taller than any man, its form shifting and unstable. Where a face should be, there was only a deep, sucking hollow. But your father's sorrow was rich. "Aged like a fine wine," the voice rasped, seeming to come from all around him. "But yours is fresh, sharp. I have been so hungry." Elias tried to speak, to scream, but his voice was a trapped bird in his throat. The tall man, the render, glided closer. The temperature plummeted. Elias's breath plumed in the air. He could feel it now, not just a presence, but an appetite. A vast ancient hunger focused solely on him. It fed on misery, and he was a banquet. A lifetime of fear, of loneliness, of the deep, scarring wound of his mother's loss and his father's cruelty. It was all right there, simmering just beneath the surface. "This place is me, and I am this place," it whispered. "A thorn must always be here, to feed me, to hold me." Your father understood. In the end, an image flashed in Elias's mind. Not his own. His father, old and frail, standing right where this thing was now, a look of profound resignation on his face. Not fighting, but accepting. Welcoming the end as his final weary duty. The render reached for him. It had no hands, but the ends of its arms tapered into tendrils of solidified shadow, cold and sharp. They brushed against his cheek, and a jolt of pure, undiluted despair shot through him. He saw his mother's face, not as he remembered her, but broken and bloody in a wrecked car. He felt his father's hand, not in anger, but in a cold, calculated push. He saw his own life, a gray, empty stretch of offices and silent apartments, all leading back to this moment, this chair, this inheritance of terror. He was going to die. He was going to become part of this thing's feast. His sorrow consumed until there was nothing left but an empty shell. No, the thought was a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness. It wasn't a roar of defiance, just a simple, stubborn refusal. He would not be his father. He would not accept this. His accounting mind, trained to find patterns and loopholes, seized on a single phrase from the ledger. It feeds on misery. It needed his fear, his pain. What if he had none to give? It was an impossible ask. Terror was a physical thing in his veins, a scream locked in his lungs. But as the render's cold tendril touched his forehead, preparing to siphon his life, Elias did the only thing he could think of. He closed his eyes and he thought of his mother. Not her death, her life. He pictured her singing in the kitchen, the smell of baking bread. He remembered the way she'd hold his small hand when they walked through the north field, pointing out robins and rabbits. He recalled the sound of her laughter, a real, joyful sound that had no place in this house. He focused on the love, a love that his father's actions could not taint, a love that belonged only to him and her. He built a wall of those memories, brick by mental brick, and behind that wall he hid his terror. The render recoiled. A hiss, like steam escaping a fissure in the earth, filled the room. The cold lessened by a fraction. No, it rasped, its voice confused, angry. This is not the flavor. Give me your pain. Elias pushed harder. He remembered the day he left this farm, not with triumph, but with the bittersweet knowledge that he was saving himself. He thought of the first client who thanked him, the simple satisfaction of a balanced book. He thought of the quiet peace of his own apartment, a peace he had earned. They were small, fragile things, but they were his. They were not misery. He opened his eyes. The render was flickering, its form less substantial. The hollow where its face should be seemed frustrated, cheated. You are a thorn. Your blood is sorrow. It insisted, but its voice was weaker. Not all of it, Elias whispered, his voice raw. You can't have all of it. He understood now. His father had fed this thing his entire life. His bitterness, his rage, his guilt after murdering his wife, it had all been a gourmet meal for the render. Silas Thorne had become a fountain of misery, and the creature had grown strong, complacent. It expected the same from Elias. It expected a legacy of pain. But Elias had something his father never did, a memory of pure, unselfish love. And that memory was a poison to this thing. He stood up. His legs were weak, but they held. He took a step forward, toward the shifting darkness. I am leaving, he said, his voice gaining strength. This land, this house, this inheritance. I reject it. You can starve. The render let out a shriek that was the sound of tearing metal and breaking bones. It lunged at him, a final desperate surge of hunger. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and the images of despair flooded his mind again. But he held on to the picture of his mother's smiling face. He held on tight. The thing passed through him. It was like being submerged in an Arctic river. Every cell in his body screamed. But when it was over, he was still standing. He was cold and drained and trembling, but he was whole. The render was gone. The room was silent, save for the dying crackle of the fire and the relentless rain outside. The oppressive weight, the sentient malice, had vanished. Elias didn't wait for dawn. He grabbed his car keys and his wallet, leaving everything else behind. He walked out of the farmhouse, not looking back. The rain soaked him to the skin in seconds, but it felt clean. It felt like a baptism. As he drove down the muddy, overgrown driveway, his headlights cutting through the storm, he saw something in the rearview mirror. Back in the window of the master bedroom, a tall, thin shadow stood watching him leave. It was no longer reaching for him. It was just standing there, waiting. He knew then that it wasn't defeated. A thing like that, born from the misery of a place, couldn't be killed so easily. It was dormant again, weakened. But the farm was still there. The land was still steeped in the sorrow of generations of thorns. It would wait for the next one, a distant cousin, a forgotten heir. Or perhaps, in time, it would grow strong enough to venture out, to follow the scent of his blood, as his father had feared. But for now, Elias was free. He had broken the cycle. He wasn't offering his sorrow on a silver platter. He was taking it with him, and he would learn, day by day, to dilute it with the small, ordinary joys of a life lived for himself. The horror wasn't over. It was just waiting. But for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne was driving away from it, into the stormy, uncertain, and beautifully free night. The memory of his mother sat in the passenger seat beside him, a warm and silent shield against the cold that he had left behind.